All right. So again, good evening, everyone. We are pleased to have Brian Vinson as our speaker for tonight. He's currently head of customer engineering at Google, a graduate of Shaw University, has been with Google for 6 years. He'll be discussing cloud. What is the cloud? Careers in cloud, state of cloud technologies. Or clouds just things that are in the sky that rain comes out of, and things like that. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Brian.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks, DJ, and thanks for all the participants. I truly did keep this open, so I didn't necessarily bring any slides or talk track, but wanted to be pretty open. I'll start with a brief introduction, sort of my background and how I got into the space, and we can go from there if that works for everybody. Again, Brian Vinson, I'm actually based just outside of the Charlotte, North Carolina area. So Lake Wiley, South Carolina, just south of it. And I've been in this area for about 14 years or so. I've been at Google 6 years, head of customer engineering. I have a team of engineers reporting to me. We cover North Carolina, South Carolina, and some parts of Georgia. And started at Google actually as a customer engineer, so more on the technical side. Prior to Google, my background has always been fairly technical. As DJ mentioned, I do hail from Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I started my career coming out of my sophomore year of college. Started as an intern at SAS Institute as a development tester. Transitioned into a computer programming career from there at SAS, and then started at Oracle, focusing on middleware solutions, applications, databases for about 11 years before coming to Google. So fairly heavy on the technical side. And then kind of as my career progressed, I moved more into architecture, engineering, and now more business level conversations around cloud and what the value is for customers who are pursuing it. And DJ, do help me. Do you want to kind of go through questions, or do you want me to just kind of do a talk track? I want to make sure I'm clear on the direction as well and meet the expectations of the team.
It's honestly whatever you prefer. We could have a couple of questions, or if you had kind of some things you wanted to highlight first, and then we can maybe circle back to that. But whatever you prefer.
Perfect. I'll start with just some highlights and some fundamental parts, and then we can transition into some questions, Q&A. I love interaction, so either through the chat or speaking out, would love to hear feedback from those who are participating as well. So if you think about what the fundamentals of cloud are, it kind of starts with, essentially getting your information out of data centers on-prem into remote sites. And that causes and creates things like operational efficiency. So now my servers, my infrastructure, my databases, my storage, all of my technology components can be somewhere where I don't have to worry about physically managing those assets on a day-to-day basis. It started in the cloud space around infrastructure as a service. So compute, storage, networking, and people slowly transitioned to that space many, many years back. And even at that time, people were still managing their infrastructure or their software on their own, patching, maintenance, downtime. And cloud sort of progressed over those years to what is now platforms as a service. So now, how do I automate those processes? How do I not worry about the operational aspects, but let that manage through the third-party cloud providers? Google obviously is one of those, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, many others. And then the platform part got really popular, and people thought, okay, now I'm saving time, I'm saving money, I'm only using what I need, I'm only spending on the things I'm actually using. How do we put more things out there and get more operational efficiencies? And then data as a service became a really big play, getting databases out there, managed databases. Obviously, one big space in the cloud is security, and it was probably the biggest concern we had for many years getting into it. especially with financial organizations, taking ownership of people's data. And people had questions. Is it secure? Can you see the information? Can you see social security numbers and other things like that? So security is a big part of that. Who has access to what and what can they do with it? And that's a space that's ever evolving as well. And now where we're seeing a lot of traction in the cloud space is around artificial intelligence, machine learning. At Google, we spend a ton of time talking about AI and specifically generative AI, and how do we take common use cases that people are kind of experiencing and then make something useful of that, but do things with that data that you probably couldn't imagine you could do. I'll open it up to maybe one example, because we work with a number of different industries, retail, manufacturing, healthcare, you name it, in the Carolinas and beyond. And I'll give you an example of things that we don't think about as consumers on the retail space even. So you walk into a grocery store, and what are you normally trying to do? You're trying to get what you came in to get quality products, and get out fast, check out quickly. The grocery stores aren't thinking in those terms. They're thinking of, what are people buying and how can we entice them to buy more, which is why the milk is at the back of the store, because most people commonly go to get milk and dairy. You walk by other aisles. But now technology and AI is getting to a place where, as you check out, they're assessing what you're buying, many grocery stores. And if two users or two customers come in who bought milk, but also bought bread or bought cereal, you'll notice that the store strategically aligns those products on your way to those aisles, so you pick those things up. Well, that's AI. AI is actually working behind the scenes, assessing everything that everybody purchases, making sense of that information, and then presenting that in a way to say, hey, if you put these two things together, you can sell more of this. So technology just does so much. The AI space is expanding. And then the last thing we spend a lot of time on is just productivity, collaboration. We're on a Zoom now. Google Meet is also a fantastic option, so I'll put that pitch out there as well. But collaboration is huge, and prior to 2020, people used it, but ever since COVID, you notice how common it is in our lives, as we were mostly housebound for some times and trying to communicate and talk with people. So we've actually gotten to a place now where people are shutting down brick and mortar buildings using collaboration tools. Well, these tools are actually cloud solutions as well. So cloud in itself is huge, covers a lot of different areas, can be broad, but we can kind of dive into how you get into the space as well, if that makes sense. So I'll pause there. And DJ, if you've got some questions, we can dive in.
All right, sure. And for all of our attendees, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hands, or you can put any questions in the chat. But my first question was this, and we'll come out firing. What is it like currently being a Black man at Google?
That's actually a really good question. It's different, and different in a good way. And I'm trying to think of the correct way to say this. So my background, I'm originally from Savannah, Georgia. I came from Georgia to North Carolina to Shaw University, which is an HBCU. So my background has been around Black people for quite a while. And I got into corporate America, and that was not the case. I was usually the sole Black face in the room, commonly. And very rarely did I have a room with leadership where there were Black people. So it didn't necessarily give me a visual of being a Black man in the corporate space, period, and sort of climbing the ladder, because it was unseen for so many years earlier in my career. And I saw some of that at Oracle, but it was a very similar process and similar thing. Google has been different because there's a ton of diversity. I've shared this before with a couple people, but it's actually the first time I've had a manager who looks like me. And I've shared that with him as well. So it showed me that there is progression. I saw more people who look like me, and people sort of respect you as you are. So Coming into a corporate space, I'll kind of take a step back as well. It's the first place I've been where I didn't have to wear a suit every day to work. You come in sneakers, jeans, and you kind of come as you are. Being a Black man at Google, you're sort of respected in that same way. You come as you are. Nobody comes with a prejudged aspect of who you are and what you've done. I think, but you still come to the table with that mindset of I have to do twice as much to be half as good. I think that gives us drive. It gives us motivation. But it has been a place where I felt respected, appreciated, regardless of the color of my skin. And I can't really say that's been a common theme throughout my career. So good question. It shows there's progression, but again, there's still work to be done. I don't want to miss that message. So even at Google, I've been a part of DEI efforts for years, always fighting for racial equity as far as helping minority-owned businesses, helping hire people in sort of a corporate place that represents what society should look like. And it's a battle I'll continue to fight. But there are a ton of allies who've helped me fight that battle at Google. By the way, you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. And again, for any of our attendees, if you'd like to ask any questions, again, feel free to throw it in the chat, raise your hand. You should be allowed to do both. My next question is, before becoming head of customer engineering, you had background and experience as an engineer and primarily hands-on roles. How would you say those roles prepared you for being head of customer engineering?
Very good question. Every step we take in our careers, I believe, is a foundational aspect of where we ultimately end up. You learn from so many things. My roles prior to moving into management were always very technical by nature. The first 6 to 7 years of my career, roughly, I spent purely technical. In an office, didn't meet with a whole lot of people unless it was about code I was writing or something I was testing or creating or developing. And that helped me understand what the value of technology was. When I transitioned from SaaS to Oracle, my career changed because I moved in what they call pre-sales. And pre-sales is essentially taking all that technical knowledge that you've gathered for so many years and applying that to help sell software for a company. So my talks and my conversations, my interactions went from solely focused on how do I get this code to work better to how do I convince this person that this software works in a way that they want to buy it. And that introduced me to sales, and sales introduced me to things like presentation skills. And that was the biggest adjustment sort of coming out of that tech space is how do I get to a point where I can go talk for an hour, talk for 3-4 hours on a topic and hold the attention of the audience. And then that helped me get into head of engineering at Google and management as a whole, because it required me to lead. It required me to stand on what I thought made sense, but also I had to make sure that I was trusted. And there's a fine line sometimes between being technical and sales. Generally speaking, people don't always trust salespeople. You walk into a car lot, you think they're lying because they want you to buy a car, right? It's no different in the software world. Salesperson walks into a meeting, they know you want to sell them something, they need to prove they can trust you. And I was able to lean on technical knowledge to show that I was credible. And what that helped me do is, as a manager, relate to people. And also a big part of my foundations has always been helping others, whether it's community service, whether it's coaching, sports. It helped me get to a point where I can coach careers. So now it's not just how do we sell more software or how do we help customers and solve business problems. It's how do I help this person whom reports to me sort of succeed in their career. And that's a part of the job that I've quite enjoyed. And then the last part of that is I'm interviewing people almost on a weekly basis. And those interactions help me understand people's background. It helps me understand people's values and what they want out of their careers. And I'm able to kind of take that and apply that in a way that we can hire in a way that we're hiring sharp people, but we're hiring people who can be coached. Again, it goes back to coaching. So a big part of this is just giving back. And sort of the earlier parts of my career seasoned me from a person who sat in the office with the door closed, writing code, to someone who spends about 90 to 95% of my time interacting with people, talking, presenting, teaching, and coaching.
Yeah, appreciate that. So, so right now we're in a bit of a, I guess maybe some downturn. Some people have been laid off and things like that. Is cloud an area of technology that you describe as in a downturn? Or maybe some people have said it's not worth a newbie getting into, or would you maybe say it's full of growth, or how would you maybe describe it right now?
Great question. I think now it's less about being in a downturn. I actually think it's a necessity. Cloud is essentially now in everything we do. It can be something as small as, 5, 10 years ago, people carried USB devices in their pockets consistently because they had to carry things around, or in their book bag because they had to transfer files. That's not common anymore. I don't want to date myself, but also there were times when you wanted music, you had to carry that around if you wanted to listen to it. Now that doesn't exist, right? Cloud is essential to everything we're doing. Actually, DVRs, leveraging things in our day-to-day lives from TV and cable, have sort of transitioned. So it's not in a downturn. I think it's adapting, and it's adapting in a way that people are leveraging in ways that we weren't necessarily thinking about before. So now, Google Assistants or Amazon or Siri, on the Apple side, now leveraging things like AI and the cloud are becoming so common that you don't realize you're using it. So I wouldn't say it's ever in a downturn. I would say it's tough sometimes to keep up with the evolution of what cloud is. It went from servers and compute and infrastructure to what is now artificial intelligence. And quite frankly, you can watch a video now and you don't know if that person is real and what they're saying is actually them, because the technology is evolving in such a way that sometimes it becomes, quite honestly, scary. So keeping up with that evolution, I think, is the biggest challenge. But I would encourage anyone here who's thinking about getting into it from a career perspective or learning about it. It's not a matter of when you learn, if you learn about it. It's a matter of when, because it's going to apply to your life on a day-to-day basis already. It's just understanding that those aspects that you use on that day-to-day are actually influenced by the cloud. Our cell phones have apps. Those apps all interact with the cloud. So it's sort of a sweet spot for what we kind of do as a whole.
All right, thanks.
And I do see a question, it looks like, in the chat as well. Maybe we can jump to one of those too.
Sure. It was a question from I hope I'm not pronouncing your name wrong, but D'Amica. Would you like to come up and ask your question, or?
I can, if D'Amica doesn't mind, I can repeat the question and kind of answer it if that helps.
Okay. Let's see, I'm gonna move her up to talk.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello. Good evening.
As the question states, I've really been working in tech just a short while, but again, as you mentioned earlier, just the continual learning. So I started off as a UAT tester, worked in data analytics for 10 years, and now I'm working as an IT systems analyst. But I guess I lean on these events, that BIT host, or trying to do as many networking events to try to kind of build my confidence up when it comes to tech. Because tech to me is just like, you got to be this super smart person, and you got to learn how to do this and put these things together and always problem solve. So my question is, when did your confidence actually kick in? Because I'm still kind of struggling with that in that area.
That is a great question that hits home on so many levels. Your background, and I cannot make this up, is nearly identical to my path
Oh, wow.
as I started my career. My first job as an intern was as in UAT testing. And I transitioned from that to IT systems and computer programming as a part of my day-to-day role. So our pathways are a lot more similar than you may think. I start there because the confidence part, I think, just becomes a big part of being a continuous learner. I mentioned earlier, cloud is always changing. I've experienced a lot of smart people around me, and many times I've never felt I was the smartest in the room, and I think that's just the attitude I've always had. But I became confident in cloud as I started to learn more about it, just because I was in a box for so many years as an analyst, as a tester, and as a programmer, that I didn't see all the connecting parts. And when I started to learn about those connecting parts, that's when my confidence took off, because I knew I could talk on a day-to-day basis about the things I already knew. But once I started expanding that and understanding how that connected to data in the cloud, and how that data in the cloud then connected to artificial intelligence or whatever the case might be, once I understood the story, I became incredibly confident in telling that story and understanding that in a way where it made me want to dive into those areas more. So at no point in my career was I ever focused on just one thing. I was always looking to learn the next thing and not become an expert, become knowledgeable enough to have a conversation about it. And once I learned that, and I was able to learn that, and pick that up in a way where I could communicate it to someone who doesn't understand it. Okay, how do I understand what the next thing is beyond that, and have an intelligent conversation from there? And that is what kind of drove me to take baby steps each time. It might take a few weeks, might take a few months. A few times it's taken a few years to understand that next level of technology. I'll give you a prime example. At SAS, I did exactly what you kind of described. When I moved into Oracle, my career transitioned. I had to talk about services and APIs, and how the things I had been working with connect to all these other things out in the cloud and in technology. But I spent a lot of time doing that. But when I came to Google, Google was a very data focused company at the time in 2017. And I had never worked around artificial intelligence or machine learning, but that was going to be a part of my job. So I spent the first few months before I got hired learning about it. And as I got on the job, I learned on the job as well. But the confidence continued to grow every time I added a new subject or a new area of expertise to my repertoire, and expanded that. So now I can talk everything from testing all the way to AI and production and collaboration, but that just took many baby steps to get there along the way. So confidence grows as you learn more and pick more up. But even today, I'm a continuous learner. Prior to this call, I was going through training, and it's not that I'll need that training. In fact, I don't necessarily have to talk tech in my current role. But for me to intelligently have a conversation with a customer or someone looking to get into space or someone who reports to me, I need to also understand that. So that the learning never stops. But with that learning comes additional confidence.
Wonderful.
Hopefully
Thank you
that
so
answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? Feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand, and pull you up to the panel.
And as those questions may be coming in, I'll comment on one thing because I didn't touch on this, but navigating to cloud and how do you get into that from a career perspective, I think is key to the audience members as well. And that's not an overnight process either. What I do recommend for people who are getting into the space, whatever your background may be, try to find that one space within cloud that sort of resonates with you, and then kind of create a path to that. So for instance, I've got a good friend of mine who is never been in technology and is sort of worked around children and youth for quite most of his career, actually. And he's like, hey, I want to get into tech. Where should I start? I'm like, hey, what interests you? He's like, well, I think I like security. And now he's back in school and doing a certification around security and trying to get into sort of an entry level position. But he's doing an amazing job sort of in that transition. Just a key example of, you don't always think security when you think cloud or when you think tech. Those are things that that are there, but there's always a pathway. You learn how to handle security with the day-to-day things you do, and then you learn what that means when you start talking things like cybersecurity and how do I protect data and how do I stop people from stealing my passwords, whatever the case may be. And it just becomes a continuous path. So even at Google, we have certifications that we offer, and I've always encouraged people go online. Amazon has them as well. Microsoft has them as well. Those certifications are valuable because it shows you know what you're doing, but it also shows you've been willing to learn more. You can get certs around infrastructure as a cloud admin or a professional cloud architect. You can get certs around data, as a database engineer or sort of data analyst. And you can also get high-level certs. We have things called Cloud Digital Leader, which isn't really about the deep level technology. It's about understanding what cloud is. And the reason I kind of state that is I hire a lot of people. And when I do that, a lot of things that I'm looking at and we're looking at, if I see a cert, I know you know what you're talking about. So I don't have to always dig in as much to make sure you understand the tech. And we still do our due diligence, but the certs show value. And it doesn't have to be a Google Cloud cert. So if I do an interview and someone says, hey, I'm AWS certified or I'm Microsoft Azure certified in infrastructure, you know what that is? It shows that they've put some work in to understand that. They might not have even had that career. I once had a colleague who she had roughly 4 or 5 different certifications at Google, and we're doing a conference and working a booth together, and her father comes up and she introduces me. And he's never been in tech his whole life. And she's like, Brian, he just got his professional cloud architect certification. He studied for a couple months and took the test, and now he's thinking about transitioning to a career in tech because he did it and it sort of sat well and resonated to him a little bit. So even things like taking that challenge to get a certification, even in that case, propelled him into a career in tech that he didn't even quite know that was something he wanted to do at the time. So I do preach the value of certs. I've gotten at Google 3 or 4 different ones during my time. And it's just, again, being a continuous learner.
All right. And again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put in the chat, raise your hand. I know. So you had touched on this briefly as far as kind of certs, but so let's say someone's a newbie, brand new to tech, kind of in a crossroads. Like where would you recommend that they start as like that first initial step to learn cloud and kind of get that rolling?
Yep. At Google, I usually recommend 2 key certs, and I said that, and I have a Google device that's responding to me thinking I'm asking a question. And it's usually 2 areas. So we have something called a professional cloud architect certification. And all the engineers that we hire generally have that as one of the foundational pieces if they're a customer engineer in the engineering space within cloud. we require each engineer to have a certification. And that's probably one of the more popular ones, more common ones, because it's high level and it covers everything from infrastructure to development to databases, as well as, high level things like security. Now that's probably more technical. What I generally recommend for people who might have questions about it or looking to get a cert under their belt is the Cloud Digital Leader certification provided by Google. It's out there on our websites if you do a search for it. I've actually encouraged a couple folks who were in college that I've mentored to take it that were looking to get into space, because one individual is in college and he's like, hey, what can I do to make sure I have an opportunity to get a job in tech when I graduate? And I recommended the Cloud Digital Leader and Professional Cloud Architect, and he immediately said, all right, I found it. I'm studying. I got some information. But for him, he's leveraging that as a way to say, hey, when I come out of school or when I go interview for an internship, I've got a certification that I can tie that to, and have a more intelligent conversation as I go through interviews to show that I have that background. So the Cloud Digital Leader, again, our certs have lately been virtual as well as on site, but that's one that I do recommend for people who are trying to enter the space. And it's just one that there's some videos out there. You can even find YouTube videos that'll help you kind of understand how to prep for those types of certifications. So, and again, that's just Google. Amazon has equivalent certifications. Microsoft has equivalent certifications. I would limit it to those 3 organizations if you're trying to get into the space and have a cert, because generally they carry over incredibly well. Just from a competitive standpoint, those are Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, or the top 3 cloud providers in the space. So if you're trying to really learn, I would stick to those as foundational companies.
So with that said, at least maybe high level, what are some differences between Amazon, Microsoft, and Google Cloud, at least from a high level?
Yeah, we're all offering similar things in the cloud space if you look at the foundational aspects of cloud. So when I say foundational aspects, fundamentally cloud consists of infrastructure as a service, compute, storage, networking, and also platform as a service, managed databases, managed application servers, managed containers that you may deploy code into, and developing code in a way that makes that good for the cloud. And if you look at all 3 companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, we all provide those core foundational components. And generally, well, at least with Microsoft and Google, you'll see even collaboration tools. Amazon also has Chime, but it's not quite as popular in the industry. But collaboration tools are also things that are kind of popular in that cloud space as a whole. So fundamentally, we all provide those things, but there are differences along the way, right? So collaboration-wise, Gmail is very different than Microsoft Outlook. Or if you look at managed database services, Microsoft has managed SQL Server, which is common in the space, whereas Amazon would have something like Redshift, which is a managed data warehouse, and then Google would have something like Google BigQuery, which is a managed data warehouse. Fundamentally, we're providing similar services, but they have different advantages across the board. Google's strength in that space might be the networking side, because we develop our own fiber optics and high-speed connections, because we drive a lot of what goes on the internet, where Amazon's strength, well, Microsoft's strength will be, popularity around the collaboration side, because so many people are using Microsoft Teams and other aspects. And then Google might have some other advantages around developing Android and having sort of embedded software on those platforms, right? So you sort of look at the big picture, but if you're trying to learn like those differences between those companies and organizations, if you understand the fundamentals of infrastructure and platform as a service, you can jump between cloud provider and learn pretty quickly. But difference-wise, we can get into a whole conversation if you even took it to things like AI, because all three companies are spending so much time now talking about AI and generative AI, chat bots, and how to create interactive experiences online and through technology. That's been a common topic, and each one of these providers has a very different way of doing that. But I think if you understand one, it gives you sort of a way that you can enter the other companies as well. And thank you for putting those certifications in the chat as well.
Yeah, no problem. Again, we had a couple folks join. So again, if you have any questions for Brian, feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand, or either one.
And I will throw this out there to the participants. If you have a question or may not choose to ask it here as well, everybody here, you can simply look me up and find me on LinkedIn. I actually do respond to messages that are sent my way. So send a connection request, shoot me a question, more than happy to answer. I'm local to the area, so happy to help.
Cool. I had one more question. What are some core skill set a cloud generalist would need to possess, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's tougher and tougher to be a generalist these days in cloud. I'll start that way just because it's becoming so complex with the offerings. Core components, core experiences, core learnings, I would say, starting with a focus on what is infrastructure, what is infrastructure modernization, infrastructure as a service. If you understand that core component, it gives you a foundation, because I think of it as building blocks. You've got infrastructure as a service, and then you've got sort of above that platform as a service, but then above that, you've got software as a service, right? So if you understand that baseline of the infrastructure, you can sort of go up the pyramid to learn more about some of the automated offerings. So generally speaking, core components are, if you are an IT analyst or maybe a database admin or have some of that background, that's always helpful because it gives you those kind of foundational parts. And as you work your way up the chain and start to have more high-level conversations, it becomes less about the technology and more about the use cases and the things that you're trying to solve with the technology. And I think everything we do in our careers, I don't care what your job is, you should know how that connects and what the bigger picture is to that. So if I'm talking about infrastructure on a day-to-day basis, I should also know how that connects up the chain to the bigger picture of, surfacing information, reports, or whatever to an end user. Whatever you're doing, try to kind of see the big picture in it all. So if you understand infrastructure, you can kind of work your way up the chain. There are some people who jump in the cloud, and we've hired a number of people who have a pure data background. I've hired an individual who didn't really have much cloud experience, but he knew data, and he knew data well. He was a data analyst, and we can teach you the other stuff, but that valuable information he has around data, well, that's something we want to take advantage of, so we can educate you on some of those other core components. So you don't always have to start at that infrastructure layer. We've also hired people who spend most of their time in what we call DevOps, or developing code, building applications, and they might not have an interest in learning infrastructure. They want to learn how to automate what they already do. The bigger picture is be willing to learn more, be willing to understand how those components connect to other things, and just kind of understand the big picture of it all. Because I think being a generalist is great, but you kind of have to know a lot about many different things. But all generalists who come into the cloud space generally have some core background or core fundamental that they're good at. Take that, and as we kind of answered in an earlier question, and then continuously grow in other areas until you can have knowledgeable conversations about the entire platform.
Cool. And Okay. All right. So what would you say are maybe some often overlooked areas or of training or study that those either in cloud or trying to get into cloud may find value?
Yeah, overlooked areas actually come in many forms. So commonly, people who come in the cloud think of it and they think purely about servers, or they think about it purely from data or databases. And the commonly overlooked areas are generally the things that are sitting right in front of us. Or probably the most commonly overlooked area is security. Generally, because everything you do in tech, in the cloud, if it's not secure, nobody's going to use it. and I think that's something people tend to overlook. They'll come in, they'll talk technology, they'll talk data, they'll talk sysadmin. But if you can't talk about how we secure that, sometimes that messaging falls flat. So security is often overlooked. And then another area that's getting more attention but can be overlooked for people who are entering the space in the workplace is also around data visualization as well. So we all on a day-to-day basis, we look at our phones, we look at apps, we have sort of an interface that we interact with, websites. Data visualization is a big part of everything that happens in cloud, because once you have the data and once you make sense of that data, how do I represent that to the users in a way that makes sense? And how do I generate reports? How do I integrate it with Google Sheets or Excel? How do I tie it into my day-to-day life? The visualization aspect, I think, is often overlooked, because at the end of the day, you can do what you want in cloud, but if I can't make sense of that and understand it in a way that kind of sits with me, what was the whole purpose for? So data visualization is also a big part of that. We sort of group that into BI and analytics, business intelligence and analytics, and people who sort of have that data analyst background generally sort of gear to that as a whole. But that's a niche, I think, in the space that's often not represented enough. And quite frankly, I have this conversation with our teams, even here today. It's a space that we often don't have enough engineers to cover. So we're trying to educate people and catch them up in a space where if people sort of came into the space with that knowledge, it'd be incredibly helpful.
All right, I see a
Cool.
question from Jermaine.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much, Brian, for being here. So I work as a cybersecurity auditor, and the standards that my team audit against are the NERC-CIP standards. They only apply to electric companies across the country. And so at this time, the standards do not allow for any cloud technologies to be leveraged as far as, data in transit.
Yep.
However, that's changing, right? Because of the way of the world, cloud makes sense across all sorts of, different business reasoning. And, so when it comes to governance, risk, and compliance elements of Google Cloud, I haven't taken a look at it yet, but I know that I'm going to have to train up on that really, really soon.
Yep.
And so, can you provide any level of insight into GRC, or rather elements of GRC currently within Google Cloud Platform?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And it's actually perfect timing. We just talked about security as a whole, but that's actually really common. And I think I mentioned it earlier around like the financial sector as a whole. It's probably one of the most common areas we see that. Specifically, if you think about data as a whole, encryption is incredibly valuable. So if you look at the the Google Cloud side of it all. We provide governance, risk, and compliance solutions and offerings, but the key is to encrypt the data through its whole journey, right? So encrypting that data at rest, and then encrypting that data in motion across the network as well, and securing that network so that you're ensuring that there's any interception along the way of that data, that encryption does exist. And we take it a few steps further. So we actually add encryption at the hardware level once it enters the cloud, ensuring that you can't just hack into Google Cloud infrastructure and retrieve data. And then once that data is actually in the cloud, we also do things like data masking. So taking a step further, it's say, hey, social security numbers, credit card numbers, addresses, personal information, or in the healthcare space, it gets really interesting around HIPAA and other compliances and things like that. So we'll mask sensitive data, we'll encrypt the data. We've actually taken it to a point where we have, encryption keys, and we're constantly rotating those encryption keys to the point where those passwords and those encryption keys are changing every 30 seconds, every minute, right? To ensure that there's additional security within the cloud. So those are things that we're kind of seeing in the space. And then after that, we've got things in the cloud where we'll assess your inventory. Point out things that are red flags that should have additional security, and apply rules to those to add security that you might not have even been thinking about. So we're always trying to do forward thinking things. At the end of the day, we're doing these things internal at Google already. So we're sort of, from a cloud perspective, publicly providing that to end users and customers to give them a very similar experience. So even at my job, we leverage zero trust from a security perspective. I can't access anything sensitive. We don't leverage VPNs, but I have a security key for everything. If I don't have that security key, guess what? I shouldn't be on the network because I can't properly prove who I am. So we do take some extremes to it, but as a part of cloud, we're spreading that message out to people who have those questions and maybe have some reluctance to get to cloud. Yeah, we can secure your data. We can provide encryption. We can mask it. We can give you whatever you sort of need in that space, but we're going to go above and beyond to also look to say, hey, you've got some threats here. If the way your data currently resides, or there's a security risk this way, maybe we should do a pen test to sort of understand what that is and provide some options for you to have a better security experience. So it's something we spend a lot of time with. I'd say 2023, the first 3 months of this year, we probably spent 50 to 60% of that time talking security with customers, just because it was such a common problem or a common thing people were trying to solve as a whole.
Brian, did I just hear you describe that the platform, based on the behaviors, the network traffic, just general heuristics across the environment, that the platform will suggest security controls to be implemented?
Yeah, it's something we've been doing for a while. You have to understand, we are held to such strict regulatory compliance things within the walls of Google that there's not much that we haven't experienced from a company perspective. So when it comes to that, we'll create policies, we'll recommend policies based on the way things that might exist today or sit today, and make recommendations to you that you might not have been thinking about just within the environment as a whole. So that is very common in the cloud space, especially once you get your data to the cloud. You're right. Then the opportunities there expand a lot further.
Mm-hmm. And I've got one more question. So when you were at the peak of your technical learning, technical training, how would you describe your study habit?
Oh, wow. That is a question that nobody really asked. So I would say that when I was at the peak of it, I had a gift, and I would call this a gift and a curse. My wife often jokes with me about it now, but I had an incredible short-term memory. And as a part of that, for people who go through certs or have gone through their education journey, my study habits, I could memorize anything, but for a short period of time. So I could memorize anything, pass a test, pass a certification, deliver a presentation, but the information didn't always stick. So as I got older, and more so specifically at the peak, I like to think I haven't reached my peak yet, but at the peak of it, I would say that had to expand a bit, where I had to kind of make sure that the things I learned stuck, because I can't build upon something and add more to it if I can't remember what it was in the past that I knew. So I spent a lot of time learning new things, and I'm a hands-on, more of a visual person. So you give me something, a lot of times before I look at the product, before I looked at the manual, because I think I figured out how this works before you read it. But I had to read, and I had to learn how things work, but I had to reread some things. So if I started in IT and I started in UAT and development, sometimes I go back and just refresh myself on, Python or C# or Java, just to make sure I still understood those components. So at the peak of it all, I was always building upon that, um, sort of testing my previous knowledge while expanding my current knowledge. And in my earlier years in school and others, once I got the A, I kind of moved on. In my career, I had to make sure that that stayed for a while so that I could build on it and still revisit those topics as well.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. I know we're getting a little closer to 7, and want to be respectful of everyone's time and also respectful of Brian's time. So if anyone has any questions, definitely, again, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and come up to the panel. Okay. Again, so if anyone has any questions, again, put it in the chat. You can raise your hand. Again, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, but not cut anyone off if they have any questions. Okay. All right. So again, we'd like to thank Brian Vinson, head of customer engineering at Google, for taking the time to answer questions, discuss cloud, and give his hard-earned experience with us all. So again, I'd like to thank Brian Vinson for taking the time to speak to us all. If anyone has any questions, again, his LinkedIn is in the chat, or you can go to the Blackton Technology Charlotte LinkedIn page for a copy of the recording. We're posting it in a couple of days, typically, and we'll repost it on LinkedIn. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, listening in, and hope you all have yourselves a good night. And again, thanks again, Brian.
Thanks everybody for the time. Appreciate it.